Well, fingers crossed. But what I'm going to do is I'll be coming back to this outline slide periodically. This is what I want to cover today to talk with you about utilities. And today, I think I want to start with kind of two stories about utilities. One, which I think is more common, which is the story of utilities as a climate villain. I would actually argue, at least in the United States, that second to the fossil fuel industry in terms of the most sort of villainized actor in delaying or denying the existence of climate change is the utility sector, and it's no accident. I mean, this is a set of corporations that really run one of the highest emitting sectors in the economy. So all of us know that if we're going to solve climate change, it's going to have to go through electricity in the utility sector. And there's a lot of evidence that these institutions are highly corrupt, highly top down, and funding all sorts of bad climate denial type of stuff. So this is clearly a story, a narrative that we hear about utilities. But I'm going to try to offer you today a sort of different story. And the different story I'll give right now is contemporary. But what I want to do today is kind of go deeper into history to sort of uncover what utilities are and what they could be, right? So the different story I'm going to tell is one of utilities as clean energy builders. Now, you've likely heard in the news that it has been really depressing lately in the offshore wind sector, where you have a lot of private companies that have been bidding in to various states and other sort of auction markets to try to bid for contracts for offshore wind projects. And a lot of the companies are pulling out because of supply chain problems, inflation, and so forth. And so it's showing the precarity of relying on this kind of sort of process of hoping that private investors will invest in the clean energy we need. But sort of buried in all this doom and gloom, in December, we learned that actually one project is moving forward, and it's run by a regulated utility, Dominion Energy, that is just a fundamentally different type of financial entity compared with these sort of private independent wind projects, right? And so because they are a regulated utility, as this Energy and Environment News article put it, it means their investments are paid for by electric consumers, with utility regulators approving return on investment as profit. And so they've, basically been able to lock in a return, right? And so there's a lot of stability to their investment kind of program. So that's one of the reasons it's moving forward. And it's kind of amazing they're even able to build their own ship, which is a big part of the offshore wind kind of industry, having again, and a lot of reasons the projects are being delayed is because of supply chain problems with those ships, right? And they're just doing it themselves because they have this kind of rate base and they have all this money sort of locked into the utility as an institution. Now, another project, and I'm worried I'm going to alienate myself from the audience right off the bat, because this is not often a project that gets a lot of positive news, which is the nuclear build out in Vogtle in Georgia. But it is a massive project that will, now that it's coming online, deliver huge scale of gigawatts of clean low carbon or zero carbon energy now that it's built. And as you can see, I've written an article with a collaborator, Fred Stafford, in the journal Catalyst. We try to make the case that a lot of electricity politics and a lot of climate debates are shaped almost purely on the realm of exchange value and prices and cost. And we hear a lot about how renewables are super cheap, and that leads people to assume that they're just going to sort of automatically be taken up by the market. And obviously with Vogtle, the debate has focused rightly on how costly this project was, how it went over budget. But what we argue in the article is that socialists, at least, or Marxists even, should focus also on the use value aspects of a variety of energy technologies. And nuclear power does have certain advantages from a use value perspective. The energy density, if any of you sort of crunch the numbers of uranium compared to fossil fuels, but also the power density, the land use aspects of this compared to wind energy and other renewables are really significant. The fact that nuclear power provides 24/7 power is a really powerful use value in comparison to intermittent renewables. And so these use value aspects are important to emphasize, as totally apart from the concerns that are rightful about the financial budgetary problems with this project. But the main point, and by the way, I want to plug this podcast that dropped last week, Volts with Jigar Shah, where they talk about how one of the problems with our decarbonization strategy is that the United States has forgotten how to build things, how to build big infrastructure, which is ultimately what solving climate change is really going to be about. Really kind of, there's talk that we have to basically 2 or 3 or 4 times the size of our current grid to kind of take on this sort of electrify everything challenge. And in the podcast, they do say that, what, with all the critique of Vogtle, what it was a massive engineering project that got built. And now that it is built, Jigar Shah, the loan coordinator for the Department of Energy, is, he's saying that a lot of industrial companies and tech companies like Google that want for ESG purposes or other sort of climate purposes, they want access to this sort of clean 24/7 energy that Vogtle can provide. So they're going to locate in this part of Georgia to access this clean energy. So again, lots of critiques that can be had, but what this is a utility. Georgia Power, in conjunction with some public power agencies, have built this massive clean energy project that, regardless of your stance on nuclear power, is gonna be some part of the decarbonization process. And utilities are building these kind of large scale type of projects. So those are the two stories. But now I want to kind of take us into the historical origins of public utilities to kind of make sure we even understand what they are in the first place. And while doing some Google image research, I just came across this sort of dumb Investopedia explainer that I probably would put on a lecture slide or something. But I actually think it's really useful to kind of remind ourselves that this is a very specific sector of the economy that we call utilities. And it has to do with the governance of institutions that provide basic everyday amenities, right? Not just electricity, but gas, water. Used to include things like telephone service and internet now is included. These, are, you can call it basic everyday amenities, but these are like what we would call essential services that sort of undergird the everyday life of society, right? So they're really critical sectors that we, that at least, as I'm going to tell you, like the history of utilities have said, we really need to govern these things in fundamentally different ways. And one of my tried and true research methods is to pick up old dusty books like this one, which is just really a fascinating deep dive into the history of public utilities in American capitalism, written in 1957 by this kind of economic historian guy. He actually uncovers this fascinating history where he argues the idea of utilities is really rooted in feudal eras and feudalism, where they had basically like what were called at the time common carriers. Like every town would have a innkeeper that was like the town's innkeeper. And these were kind of regulated by, I don't know, the feudal lords or whatever, as like, this has to provide this fundamental service of the inn or the tavern or some sort of, again, common carrier that was, seen as essential to society and had to be governed. The other thing he traces it to, in the medieval times and feudal eras, there was a lot of discourse on what was called just pricing, right? Or the just price regulation, and trying to kind of, regulate these emergent trade networks to make sure they weren't gouging society on basic, goods and services that society needed, right? And he argues that this kind of common carrier just price regulation sort of bled into what eventually became public utilities regulation. When I started diving into thinking more about utilities, I quickly realized that some of the arguments I thought I wanted to make have already been made. And I would really highly encourage everyone on this call to read this pretty long but incredibly illuminating and convincing argument made about, I think, 10 years ago by William Boyd, who many will know as doing really critical work in political economy of nature with Scott Prudhomme and Rachel Sherman and others. But he really just makes a beautiful case in this article that, if solving climate change is this big public crisis that requires a public response, we have this kind of model historically of public utilities that are sort of charged with solving public crises. Water utilities were really set up to sort of deal with the public crisis of kind of waterborne disease and death in sort of early urban environments. And sort of this kind of uncovering this history of utilities is really important. And he argues, it really has its origins in the early 20th century, where he says progressive lawyers and legal scholars, legal realists, and institutional economists sort of argued that we really need to have this sort of separate sector of the economy you can call a public utility. And he says key elements of this earlier conception of public utility include the recognition that certain types of businesses should be subject to regulation in the public interest, that competition should be viewed as a tool rather than an end state, and that the entire undertaking of public utility regulation should be considered experimental and open to new pathways and possibilities. Most importantly, public utility was seen as a common collective enterprise aimed at managing a series of vital network industries, and this is key, that were too important to be left exclusively to market forces, right? So this is kind of, these progressives in the early 20th century are like, this stuff, electricity included, is really so important to society that we can't just leave it to capital and leave it to the market. A lot of this regulation also has its origins in this Supreme Court case of 1877, where they basically said that government has a sort of role in regulating certain private property that is sort of necessary for the public good. And in the article, he cites these thinkers who are saying, what we're really talking about is curbing the power of property, which as a Marxist gets my eyebrows up when I hear that. I mean, that's what essentially these public utility people were saying. We really need to curb the power of capital and the power of property to, make sure these essential services are regulated in the public interest, right? So that's the kind of the origins. So now this is likely sort of review for many of you, but just to kind of tell the story of how this public utility system came to be, and then how it got really, as we would say, restructured or sort of broken apart. And so I have this sort of quick 20th century story of electricity capital in 4 acts. And I should give a little shout out that Nikki Luke and I did. I think people on this call, some of them contributed to this special issue we did on electricity capital, which is an effort to really try to think through the electricity sector through political economy and theories of capital. In the introduction, we define electricity capital as the nexus of state regulatory and financial relationships that shape private accumulation through electricity provision. It's clear that because of this sort of utility history, a lot of the electricity system isn't governed by private for-profit entities, but a lot of it is. So sort of teasing out those relationships is what we're trying to get at. And going back to the history of electricity, I think it's really important to point out, really from the start, we sort of founded our electric system on capitalism. And this is Thomas Edison, for those that don't know. And this is a picture of the Pearl Street Station, the first centralized power station that was built in the United States. And you might know that it was built in New York City, but you might not know it was built near Wall Street, right? Because Edison was hoping to attract capital, trying to attract investors in this nascent electricity system. And so from the very start, the electric power industry was kind of attached at the hip with capital, right? And that, I think one of the core arguments I want to get across today is sort of, we've kind of been stuck with this capitalist imperative that sort of does create some problems for what we want to do for climate change and stuff. Okay, so the early 1900s, you might know about Samuel Insull, who came out of this kind of electricity capitalist kind of history. But, you know, what he agreed to, and he and others, is, you know, he was running these sort of private utilities, and there was a lot of debate in the industry. A lot of the industry people thought, you know, we'll just build a bunch of smaller power plants and service big industrial customers, and we'll just have these sort of enclaves of people that have electricity who have the money to pay for it, and other people won't. And there was a lot of sort of agitation at the time that, you know, this electricity system should be a sort of universal essential service that gets distributed out to the population. And Insull kind of agreed to what, and again, this book, I'm sure many of you are aware of, Power Loss by Richard Hirsch, a real sort of landmark study of the utility system and its deregulation. He calls what Insull agreed to, is he refers to it as the utility consensus, which is that we'll keep these utilities privately owned by capitalist, investor owned, and they get to make a return on their investments. But we're going to give them monopoly franchises for particular territories. You can still see in New York State today, there's these utilities that still have kind of monopoly control over at least the distribution side of utilities here. And but the trade-off for Insull, at least, and others, was that these monopoly utilities were going to be governed and regulated by public utility commissions. So they really, you know, this public utility law and progressive thought really said, you know, we can't just let capital have all the power, right? We got to have these regulatory systems. Now, as this quote indicates, Insull was sort of thought this was the least worst outcome for his industry. That he was very confident that if we set up statewide utility commissions, that the capitalists that ran those things could basically capture those commissions and corrupt them for their own purposes. So he happened to think this was going to be fine. But to be clear, and it's kind of funny, I just saw this last night, so I thought I'd put it up here. There was a real sort of threat of kind of municipal socialism at the time, sometimes called sewer socialism. And you know, the reason Insull agreed to public utility regulation and public utility commissions was because there was this threat of, why don't we just take over, as this cartoon calls it, the big stick of municipalization. There was this big threat that these utilities could be just taken over by the government, right? Publicly owned. So he said, let's keep them privately owned, and we'll let them be regulated as public utilities. But one thing I wanted to get back to is that really meant that even though we call these capitalist utilities, right, they still were, in the kind of legal sense, still considered public utilities. Even if they weren't publicly owned, they're publicly regulated, you know. And again, this sort of utilities law was informing that. Okay, fast forward, this is going to have to go pretty quickly. So we handed over the utilities to these capitalists, and then lo and behold, they did all this crazy corruption and, set up these holding companies and, all this financial chicanery. And by the 1930s, there was a huge backlash against this, and the in the New Deal and the Franklin Delano Roosevelt administration, they really sort of built this public power alternative as a kind of challenge to the private utility system. And so during the 30s, we get much stronger government regulation of the private utilities, but also the kind of expansion of publicly owned generation companies and increased municipalization all over the country. And, again, I think a lot of this was based on the sort of conviction that capital was not really fulfilling its role of providing this service for all. So I love this Tennessee Valley Authority, electricity for all, which sounds like a Bernie Sanders slogan. This idea that a lot of these poor rural areas that didn't have electricity, in 1934, only 10% of farms had electricity. By 1950, it was over 90%. Capitalist utilities were not going to build out service to these rural areas because it wasn't profitable for them. So the public power challenge really said, if capital is not going to do it, we have to do it. And whether it was the TVA or the Bonneville Power Administration, they're really kind of building out this alternative that actually delivered electricity as a kind of public service. And as you can see, like some of these, the Federal Power Act of 1935 really tried to reassert that if we're going to run this system as a business, it still has to ultimately be affected with the public interest. And so this sort of public utility law remained in sort of in spirit. Okay. So out of that, we had the TVA, we had the BPA, we had a lot of different public power challenges, but by and large, kind of the utility consensus and the investor-owned utilities kind of maintained their control into the post-war era. And it entered an era that's often referred to as the grow and build strategy, where since utilities could get a return on new investments, they wanted to build more power lines, more power plants, more infrastructure. And this is often much maligned in the sort of environmentalist literature, because ultimately the utilities were kind of like basically encouraging households and businesses to kind of consume as much electricity as possible because it allowed them to continue to grow and build. And it kind of locked in a lot of the more wasteful, excessive consumption that we still sort of struggle with today. But Hirsch, and this is a chart from Hirsch showing that for all the kind of critiques of this grow and build strategy, that what they really also did was develop tremendous economies of scale. They really made their power plants more efficient and more basically allowed them to develop less costly electricity on a mass scale. And this is just showing the prices going down over the course of the 20th century. And so Hirsch makes the case that at least in the post-war era, this grow and build strategy was kind of, obviously dealing with a big period of massive capitalist growth and basically building this incredible grid system that we now kind of take for granted, but that some have called the most complex machine on Earth. And one institution, I'm forgetting who it was, named it the greatest engineering achievement of the 20th century is the United States electricity grid. And so, I think Hirsch kind of makes the point that the utilities in this period did a decent job of kind of building this essential infrastructure, even if they were capitalists that were making profits at the same time. Now, things started to go badly for the utilities. And in the 1970s, because of the energy crisis and because of kind of certain, they sort of hit the wall in terms of the types of efficiency gains they could get from their power plants, and because they were reliant on these volatile fossil fuels like natural gas or coal, you start to get this real public backlash against utilities. And to me, this is kind of, I've written a lot and thought a lot about the 1970s. It's not just utilities, it's just neoliberalism and Milton Friedman and Hayek and all these people are kind of reacting to the sort of post-war Keynesian kind of big managed capitalism. And they're kind of sort of reacting to all these kind of big sort of, massive and sometimes inflexible institutions. Now, they also were not very fond of unions at the time, but utilities, universities, big monopoly corporations, all these kind of big hulking institutions were seen as uncompetitive and inefficient and inflexible. And the neoliberal return is, or sort of reaction is all about kind of like, we need to smash these things and make them more efficient and competitive in the market. And utilities are no exception. And so we see a wave of deregulation, this idea that these systems, whether it be airlines or telecommunications or whatever, have to be kind of broken up to be made more competitive. And, we kind of always date this as like, the Reagan revolution of neoliberalism, but we should not forget that the real sort of OG deregulation person was, of course, Jimmy Carter. And I should give a shout out to Morgan Robertson, who's done some really good work on kind of uncovering the kind of early history of Jimmy Carter and kind of building the neoliberal environmental state in a lot of ways. So this led to all this impetus to break up this electric utility system, okay? And so now I want to kind of explain what that looks like and how it has really, I think, sort of eviscerated this idea that electricity is this sort of coherent, essential service that should be managed by a publicly regulated system. And now it's been turned into this very fragmented set of different constituencies and capitalists competing in these different markets, right? So I was pretty proud of this gridlocked pun I was able to come up with for this part. But as many of you know, the probably the most important consequence of what some call restructuring or deregulation was that they said, okay, we understand that the electric transmission and distribution might be natural monopolies, and it's not smart to have a bunch of competing capitalists just like laying wires against each other. But why don't we just open up the generation side, so the production of electricity? Why can't that be run as a kind of market or a capitalist market? So what deregulation meant was that in some states, a lot of utilities had to literally divest their generation assets. And in some states, they were allowed to maintain them, but they had to now compete with a new class of capitalist that some call merchant generators or some call independent power producers, who are just private capitalists who are just trying to sell power into the market and compete with other capitalists to sell that power. Now, what I'd like to emphasize is this is a fundamental break from the idea that people that are in the electricity business are fundamentally part of this essential service that should be publicly regulated in the public interest and the public good. These merchant generators, which exclusively includes basically the renewable solar and wind producers, they're just capitalists trying to sell. They're just like, if they're trying to sell shoes, it doesn't matter. They're trying to sell commodities in a market, and they're just trying to make profit off those sales. There's no sort of public utility kind of spirit to this market now. It's just been sort of turned over to capitalists, and for better or worse, right? And so you can just see it's a real uneven geography, right? There are parts of the Southeast that still have good old Hirsch's utility consensus, where you have regulated utilities that control vertically integrated generation, transmission, distribution. But in a lot of states, you have, the deregulation of generation, or sometimes retail competition, where you have different deregulation going on. But for our purposes, I'd like to emphasize that what's really changed the game is we've set up these, what are sometimes called regional transmission operators or independent system operators, RTOs, ISOs, which are these sort of weird independent grid operators that now run these wholesale markets for different producers that are now competing in these electricity wholesale markets to sell electricity into the grid. And this book is really quite a powerful kind of analysis of how these RTO systems work and how they kind of unwittingly kind of advantage sort of natural gas, and in some cases, if they're subsidized enough, renewables, but often natural gas at the expense of more capital intensive generation like nuclear and coal. In any event, what it shows is that it's really interesting that we've handed over the governance of the grid to these entities that are actually not part of the public sector at all. They're nonprofits. They're sort of very not transparent, right? They're not the same thing as a public utility commission that has to have sort of transparent public hearings and things like this. They're very kind of these sort of in the parlance today, smoke-filled rooms where a lot of these decisions are kind of made through their members, and so it's a bit of an interesting shift that we've kind of gone to, and it's very new. A lot of these systems have been set up in the last 20 plus years, right? So this is like very new terrain. We've sort of gone on this experiment of marketization and unbundling of electricity in this way, and we're kind of trying to see how it works as we go along. And I'd like to sort of shout out this work by an anthropologist on really like an ethnography of electricity markets. And she shows how it's just really wild that we think we can operate electricity like a market. This is a grid operator's sort of control room. And like electricity is best controlled by like Soviet style socialist planning, because you must, as you all know, you must always balance supply with demand. Sometimes these areas are called balancing areas because the grid operators, what they have to do is balance. And so what they're doing is setting up these sort of wild markets that allow people to compete and trade, but they have to bid onto these markets to make sure that all the people bidding in, and when they actually produce the electricity, it's matched exactly with demand. And as she says here, this sort of attempt to kind of gluing engineering and economics, like taking microeconomic models and trying to match it with the physics of the grid, is a real sort of bizarre enterprise, but one that neoliberal ideology has kind of pushed us into thinking is okay. And she shows how basically it's just a handful of these professors at MIT that kind of design these spot markets for electricity. And to be fair, like they did like a really thoughtful job in sort of figuring out an actual rational way to have a marketized electricity system when it has these real constraints. Gretchen Backey's really wonderful book, The Grid, she says, electricity is not like bananas. It's not like any commodity. It's really this sort of essential infrastructure that has to be carefully managed at all times. Otherwise, it completely breaks down, and it's a big problem. I don't want to go into what all this means, but it's just to illustrate how complex these markets are. They have day-ahead markets where people bid into, hour-ahead, real-time markets. They have capacity markets, and all these markets are trying to kind of do this quite costly work of figuring out how you're going to actually balance supply with demand, which in the old days, the utility would just do it themselves because they had this monopoly vertically integrated control. And because we said that's bad, now we're trying to do it via markets. And the thing I want to get through in this section is that this has led to incredible fragmentation of the grid. And now we have this weird process that some of you might have heard of called interconnection queues, where these grid operators are kind of managing all these scattered generators or merchant generators or independent power producers who want to get a connection to the grid, an interconnection, and they have to get into this line, and they're all competing to get into this queue, and it's just sort of like what Marx and Engels called the anarchy of the market, this kind of chaotic process. It sometimes will take 4 or 5, sometimes even longer, many years for them to get a connection. Most proposals to the interconnection queue never get built. They're just speculative by these private merchant generators the kicker is that ultimately we should know that the grid, if someone's going to connect to the grid, it's got to sort of, you have to build transmission, and that's a social cost. It's a socialized cost that you would hope there'd be some public government entity that could socialize that cost of building the transmission infrastructure. But because we've sort of atomized and fragmented this system, the interconnection queue in the United States, a lot of the grid operators, they just say that the independent power producer has to pay all the interconnection cost, right? Themselves. They have to take it on themselves, which is why many of their proposals turn out to not be viable for a financial perspective. And, you know, I was learning recently in offshore wind markets, like I think it was the Netherlands and maybe Norway or one of the Scandinavian countries, for offshore wind, the government pays for the interconnection. They pay for the transmission because they recognize it's this sort of public social infrastructure cost that has to be taken on by a public entity. But not here in the US. We just expect one private generator to have to take on this social cost of the whole grid. And lo and behold, it's not working particularly well. And so we have this really fragmented system when what we need is a much more coordinated, planned approach to the grid to solve climate change. Okay, so now I kind of want to take a little detour to look into, and I'm probably going a little bit longer than I planned. So just quickly, basically what I argue, what we've argued in an article, and I'll get to it in a second, is that the left now is sort of bifurcated in electricity politics between kind of environmentalists who are very keen on expanding renewables as the sort of answer to climate change, right? And so you have a lot of green NGOs who are really about expanding renewable production and moving towards a 100% renewable type of system. You've had a lot of the kind of climate intelligentsia sort of embrace this idea that we can run the grid according to basically 100% wind, water, and solar based off certain scientific modeling that is contested, I should say. But in any event, you have basically a lot of energy into promoting the expansion of renewables. Well, the point is, and I've lost track of how many times I recommend this article. It's so good. Because of how the United States has set up renewable energy financing and the centrality of tax credits to this, basically it ensures that all renewable generation is going to be owned by these private independent power producers, because it's only private entities that can take advantage of these tax credits. That's changing a little bit with the IRA. So watch this space. But prior to the IRA, it's even utilities themselves have been really prevented from taking advantage of these. And so it's basically these IPPs that can get. And so the green left has been sort of aligned with this fraction of capital, the sort of merchant generators. And so a lot of the left becomes really focused on renewables. I live in a state where there's really, to be fair, this sort of heroic victory of winning the expansion of a public generation utility here in New York State that was set up by Governor FDR, called the New York Power Authority. That just gives it the ability to build renewable energy projects, which it didn't have before. And it's pretty cool expansion of public power. But one thing, the more I've dug into this, I've realized that all this legislation really does is it just allows the public utility now to sell power, to maybe build public renewables, and then they get to sell that public renewables into this deregulated wholesale market, because New York is a deregulated state. And there's this way in which this kind of campaign actually does not challenge the fundamental problem, in my sense, which is that we've actually, the restructuring and the deregulation and the marketization of our electricity sector has made it so fragmented and hard to coordinate and plan. And again, this legislation is just focusing on allowing public entities to compete in the wholesale market with other private renewable producers. And I have real concerns that they're not going to be able to compete as well with those private producers. So in any case, that's just a tangent. So you have sort of green left people really focused on the expansion of renewables, but that aligns them with sort of independent power producers, merchant generators. Labor unions, on the other hand, the other side of the left, have been consistent sort of criticizers of deregulation, right? This is from 1999, from the really incredible labor organization Labor Notes, that really talked about how the unions involved in electricity saw deregulation as kind of like a NAFTA moment, a real attack on their workers and members and unions. And in fact, it's true. Since 1999, the unionization rate in the electric utility sector has gone down, actually. And what I find interesting about this article is they're arguing that deregulation is not just going to hurt them and their wages, it's going to really degrade the service of electricity. And if you read further in the article, they're really arguing that, you know, we unionized workers are the people that keep the lights on, which I should mention last night came in handy when we were, you know, it was getting very cold and our heat was off, but the utility people got the lights back on within 3 hours. So it was I was thankful for them. And they really thought deregulation was going to make the grid less reliable. And they were trying to sort of argue against it, not just for their own interest, but for the interest of sort of the social infrastructure that they take a lot of pride in upkeeping, right? And they're concerned about sort of the marketization of the generation space, because the infiltration of independent power producers and merchant generators has not been good for unions. And in fact, solar and wind IPPs have been not great employers, not great bargainers. And as you all know, like, these sectors are really not characterized by good union jobs in a lot of cases. It's a lot of transient work. It's marginal, precarious, very difficult to organize. Really, if you look any article up after today, I would recommend this one by Lauren Gurley, which just shows how terrible working in the solar sector can be. People working away from their families for weeks on these kind of you know, transient jobs, exposed to health hazards or workplace hazards like extreme heat and alligators, as you can see here. I mean, it's really precarious for this sort of brave new world of independent power producers for the workers. And so what we try to argue in this article is that the unions are quite aligned with the utilities, because they see the utilities as historically providing a very conducive space for organizing union power and getting good union contracts. And so you have this bifurcation of the left, where you have the kind of green environmentalists sort of aligned with the fraction of capital like independent power producers, merchant generators, and you have the unions aligned with the utilities. Oh, and I forgot to mention, it's not just the independent power producers, but a lot of these big tech companies are aligned with further deregulation and restructuring of the market, because they don't like the fact that when Google sets up in the utility area that they can only buy energy from one entity, they want to be able to have a flexible market, and they want to buy from a lot of different IPPs, and they want to have flexible contracts. So this New York Times article shows how really Google has become a big voice for deregulating the utilities in the South. Okay, so finally, this is kind of the kicker slide, where I'm going to really try to say that a lot of our hatred of utilities is in many ways justified, but I worry we're going to throw the baby out with the bathwater, and we have to kind of recognize that the utility model that really has this deep historic origins has a lot of benefits to it that we might want to think about, particularly in the crisis of the 21st century, which is climate change. So here we go. And I should also mention that some of these arguments are going to be part of an essay that's forthcoming in a really cool magazine called Damage. Their second issue is about to hit very soon, and please subscribe. And we have this very catchy title, The Utility of Utilities. So what is the utility of utilities? First, okay, utilities, even, you know, there's a lot of cynicism about PUCs or public utility commissions. They are often quite corrupt and captured, but ultimately utilities are this publicly regulated essential service. And I think if we're going to solve climate change, we need to harness that kind of spirit of like, this is a public crisis and we need to solve it through public sector kind of regulations, but also the expansion of the role of the public in building out this critical infrastructure, right? So the utility model has that going for it. Second, now as the Dominion case in the offshore wind, what ratepayer financing is for these utilities that are able to get their investments approved by public utility commissions, it's a kind of socialization of their investment through the rate base, right? This is very useful if you want to expand investment, right? And that's, of course, what we need to do to solve climate change is massive new investment in clean energy, right? So the utility model actually has this kind of socialized model of investment. Now, socializing investment through the rate base is regressive because it makes you're basically funding your investment through equal amounts because electricity is kind of inelastic good, so the poor are consuming a fair amount and not considerably less than the rich. So like everyone's kind of giving roughly equal amounts to the rate base, and this is really regressive to the poor and working class. So we would prefer a public model that actually finances investment through income taxes and progressive taxation, right? That would be the more ideal model. But regardless, you do have this socialized investment model that utilities have. It's a real tried and true model, right? I remember when I shared the Dominion wind energy case and like, look, they're able to build this offshore wind and no one else says they can do it. And some person replied and said, oh yeah, I could build offshore wind if I had a guaranteed rate of return, blah, blah, blah. This sort of typical, like these utilities, they have it so easy. But don't we want to make it easy as possible to build clean energy? That should be the goal. We don't want to make it hard. We don't want to make it so you have to really compete really hard in the market. We want it to be super easy to build clean energy, and utilities have a very super easy investment model. Also, utilities can plan, particularly the vertically integrated ones, but even the ones that just control distribution, they are this kind of central planning institution, which I think we need more of in the grid and electricity. Utilities have to do this thing called integrated resource planning, where they really do justify to the regulators, like, these investments are part of a plan to kind of service the needs of growing electricity consumers. And so there's this kind of central planning that is inherent to the utility model. Okay. Some of you may have heard that Brett Christophers has yet another book, and I have to admit, I'm reading it and it's incredible, but I'm not quite finished with it. I'm a little over 200 pages into his new book, The Price is Wrong. I think I read his books slower than he writes them, but it's really good. And the fundamental argument is that for all the talk of how cheap renewable energy is from a price standpoint, that is not actually what guides investment in renewables. What guides investment, is it profitable enough, right? Is it sufficiently profitable? And he argues very persuasively that the reason we're not expanding renewable production across the world is because it's just not attractive to investors. It's not as profitable as, say, oil and gas. Well, what's sort of interesting is that when you go back to this utility model, which Christophers doesn't really engage with much, simply because he's focusing a lot on solar and wind, and a lot of that production is now in this new world of wholesale markets and deregulation. But the utility model was precisely set up to guarantee profitability, right? Like that is the whole nature of even us socialists who would be really not cool with investor-owned private utilities, but even those are set up so that their profitability is guaranteed. So there's this kind of answer with the utility model to Christophers' entire analysis here. So obviously I'd prefer if we just nationalize the grid and take it over as a public power entity. But even if we kept it in the hands of investor-owned utilities, they could solve this profitability problem much easier than independent power producers. And I already said this, there's not much to expand on. Unions, the utility system is just, when you have a single entity that runs this critical infrastructure, you can imagine how it's much easier to organize worker power and unions in that kind of centralized, highly coordinated system. This is a big deal, not just because we think we're going to electrify everything, EVs and heat pumps, but because of AI and other digital technologies, we are going to start expanding electricity consumption and demand at a level we haven't really seen. I would say not, what we're looking at is more akin, I would say, to the post-war era of huge, what they call in the industry, load growth, huge load growth. Like we're going to triple the grid in terms of load growth. And what that means is, again, we need to grow and build, right? And that's what utilities, even the investor-owned ones, were so good at doing. Now, what happened with the energy crisis of the 70s, it led to all this change. And actually what we've had for many decades is pretty stagnant load growth, right? It's just been and again, this is very focused on the United States. It's different in other places. But in the United States, there's been sort of stagnant demand. So the utility model is not so great in that context. But in the 21st century, where we know we need to massively expand the grid, the utility model makes a heck of a lot of sense. Now, again, I think the origins of our problems are that we said in the early, really, we let people like Thomas Edison set up electricity next to Wall Street. But really, when we told Samuel Insull that, okay, we're going to allow private capitalists that are only seeking returns on their investments to control this critical utility system, and we'll just regulate you, that to me is at the heart of a lot of our problems, right? To put the profit motive in this critical service. We don't do that for water utilities, and for the most part, right? So why do we do it for electricity? So as a proper left person and socialist person, I do think we want to move away from investor-owned and private utilities and toward public utilities. And just to put a last plug in for my work with Fred Stafford, and we've been trying to sort of think about bigger models of public power than oftentimes I think on the left. There's a very sort of decentralized vision of small scale, rural electric co-ops or municipal utilities. But we actually need to restructure the entire grid very quickly, very fast. And for that scale of transformation, we need to think big, and we are quite fond, with all its warts and problems that it had at the time, the Tennessee Valley Authority and the Rural Electrification Administration, these kind of big public sector led investment models that did set up now the TVA still as this utility that services millions of customers in the valley, and does so as a public entity seeking sort of embarking on a public mission and not doing it for profit, right? So that's the kind of vision we think we need to expand. And actually, so many years ago, this vision was right at the core of Bernie Sanders' campaign, and it came from a socialist think tank, the People's Policy Project, that proposed, why don't we just allow federal power agencies like the TVA to massively expand clean energy generation all over the country? And so this expansion of federal public power all over the country is sort of a bigger scale vision of public power than your typical, let's just municipalize our local city or something. And I'll end here. And sorry to do a little self-promotion, just to give a little plug for my recent book, which was already mentioned. But I will say I've taken a lot of heat and a lot of criticism for the book, because people sort of accuse me of being nostalgic or overly romanticizing industrial workers and electricity workers. Well, my counter to that is that if we're really gonna build a new industrial energy system, who do you think is going to do that work? Who is gonna build all these new transmission lines, all this new power infrastructure generation? We need new public transit. We need new green housing. And, you know, it's not just electricity workers, it's the building trades, it's these manual industrial workers that have to build this new world. And so it's not a moral calculation, it's a strategic one, that these are the workers that are going to be at the core of building this new green energy system. And we have to take these unions and these workers seriously and try to figure out how to orient our campaigns toward them, or actually with them, and having them be the ones that really guide our visions of decarbonization. And this is kind of aligned with you know, the Ezra Klein sort of, he's been talking about, we need a liberalism that builds, right? And we need this kind of new, he calls it supply side liberalism, that, you know, we're going to build housing, we're going to build solutions to climate change. You know, characteristically of Klein, he doesn't talk a lot about the workers and the unions and the people that are going to do the building, right? And so that, I think, has to be at the core of that. And again, it's those workers that put my power back on at midnight last night, who are out there in the freezing cold, in the wind, that got that power back on. And so we have to sort of center those workers, and it's a strategic imperative that we do so. So I'm sorry if I went way too long, but that's when I will stop, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Matt. That was amazing, and I think gave us all a lot of food for thought. Oh, at this point, I will allow participants to unmute themselves, and we're past the hour, but if people want to stay, I think you know, we should do a few questions and answers. So go ahead and unmute yourself, or raise your hand, or drop a question in the chat. I guess I'll start with a question, Matt. My question is about strategy, I guess, on what you think or what you're witnessing as working, because when you were talking about some of the challenges of the fragmentation and the sort of solutions that are being proposed, I thought of my work in Chile, which is running into a lot of struggles with IPPs becoming financially unviable because of some of these prices wrong sort of issues.
Yeah.
But the solutions that are being proposed, at least in Chile, are sort of even more extreme economic acrobatics to find the right prices for auxiliary services and for storage, and sort of more complex and abstract market structures. And Chile's a different case than the States, but I'm curious what you're seeing as you know, in contexts where nationalization is very politically unfeasible. I guess I'm curious to hear your thoughts about strategy, or what you're seeing.
Yeah. You know, one of, I will say, the sort of depressing things about Christopher's book, which is a real sort of cold, sober analysis, is he sort of accepts that we're moving more towards more marketization and more restructuring, and that's just the way it is, right? And as a person who finds this a real destructive process, like I react to that, but he's probably right. But it's if we're gonna sort of build you know, socialist campaigns, they have to be against that process and try to prevent it from moving forward. I recently learned, and I'm not sure if this is true, but that Chile was perhaps one of the first countries to try to restructure its electricity market because of 9/11 and because of the coup and because of the imposition of neoliberal governance very early in there. And so I think Chile is a real fascinating history to look into. You know, all I'll say is I know that Boric and the left came into power there, and there was a real setback with the constitutional process. But on the other hand, I do know that that they have proposed things like nationalizing their lithium mines, and we know Allende did want to nationalize the copper, and so there is a tradition in Chile of taking public control over resources in conflict with capital that I would hope folks are trying to harness. Because if the goal is to further fragment and further marketize and further make sort of everything contingent on anarchic markets and competition, that's not going to make it any easier to coordinate a decarbonization process.
Yeah, thank you. Any other questions from the audience?
Yeah, hi. Thank you. Wonderful presentation. I'm just wondering if you, because it's something that I'm struggling with thinking about a little bit, but haven't made much progress, if you've thought and about having any intuitions on what the role of utilities playing the part of independent power producers in jurisdictions outside of their kind of traditional regulated monopoly control areas, has what the implications are for the thing that I'm mostly on board with, trying to kind of wrest some degree of power in these markets from the independent power producer and return it to the regulated monopoly utility products.
Yeah, so some really interesting cases I wish I had time to get to. Obviously, there's NextEra, which came out of Florida Power and Light, which has become the largest solar and wind producer in the country, I believe. And so the way in which they've been able to kind of create this new business model that kind of infiltrates other states and other wholesale markets is interesting. And the Christopher's book has some good stuff on them and how dependent on the state they are in terms of tax credits and subsidies. But it again, like, to me, like, it just shows, like, why are we handing over these monopoly utilities to these capitalists? Because what capitalists do is they want to accumulate capital and grow and sort of get into new models of profit making, and that, more power to them. That's what NextEra has done. I don't think I saw him here, but obviously, hopefully you all know Connor Harrison's work, and I know he's done some work on actually in Florida, where they've been able to pass just new rules that have made the regulated utilities, Florida Power and Light, have been able to build a lot of huge solar projects in the state of Florida, which is rare, right? Again, most states, even a state like Nebraska that's like 100% public power, actually, if you look at who's running the solar and wind operations in that state, it's all IPPs, right? But in Florida, they let utilities build solar, and shocker, they built a ton of it, right? They built a lot of solar, and they've been really effective at expanding solar in Florida. So I think Florida's another case to look at of how utilities can be this kind of catalyst of building, right? Which is what we need.
Looks like we have a question in the chat from Max.
Let's see here.
If you could choose between nationalizing fossil... Go ahead.
Sorry.
Please go ahead.
Hi, sorry. Yeah, this is partly coming from a UK context, which there's sort of two discourses about nationalising the fossil fuel industry to wind it down faster, but also nationalising the national grid. But just looking at the cost of that, and I don't know about the US context, but just seems to me that there had, if you had to choose, or do you think have you done any costing of that in the United States?
Oh God, I'm not great at the quantitative cost analysis, but I know it was kind of interesting that in COVID, when oil was selling for negative value, if you remember. A lot of people, I remember Adam Tooze saying that now is the time to nationalize, because actually these companies were valued so low at that moment. Of course, things have changed, and sadly, a lot of, 2022 was a banner year for fossil fuels. They're making more profits than ever. So I imagine lately it's going to become a much higher price to take them over. I'm glad you asked this straight up question, because I would much prefer to nationalize the grid, because I do believe, obviously solving climate change is a destructive process of, as Christian Prince says, euthanizing the fossil fuel industry. We must shut it down, and that's great. But we still live in a world that's 80% powered by fossil fuels, and so that means we have to build an entirely new energy system not based off fossil fuels. And that gets in, and that's why I would nationalize the grid, because that would be about building that new world. It's sort of a trendy term, but I love that term, world building, right? Like, get new world, and that's what I think the Green New Deal at its best was trying to really give us a vision of, we can build public luxury, public goods that really make life better for the majority, and that excites me, right? And so I think in many ways, I think the environmental movement has focused a lot on what we need to tear down and what we need to destroy, and we need to, shut down pipelines or blow them up, or shutting down coal power plants, and that's all good and important. But we need to build a new energy system, and that's gonna be a different type of politics, and one that I think, as Ezra Klein would say, it's a type of politics that really can sort of build a kind of big coalition around, right? That New Deal coalition that lasted for decades was really formidable for good reason. And so if we did, and also, just by the way, if we nationalized the grid, we could coherently plan out the phase out of fossil fuel generation, which would indirectly harm the fossil fuel industry if not nationalize them, right? So that's why I would definitely nationalize the grid. Brad, you want to jump in?
Yeah, thanks, Matt, for this presentation, and good luck with your keeping your energy going there. And you mentioned a couple times some folks that were on Dave Roberts' Volts podcast. I was just curious if he's reached out to you to be on.
No, he actually mentioned on Twitter last night that he wants to have Brett Christophers on. So I emailed Brett and said, "Look, you got to get on." But the best I've had is I've had Dave Roberts quote tweet me a couple times approvingly. So, and I love his podcast. I listen to it a lot. But I also think his sort of shtick is a bit kind of leans toward this sort of, utilities, those bad utilities, right? A lot of his episodes are about like the just horrible graft and evil corruption, and how the utilities are really standing in the way of this great clean energy transition. And so that kind of narrative, I find a bit sort of papers over a lot of the things I tried to argue for here. So I think if he did have me on, it could be kind of interesting and maybe somewhat contentious conversation, because I don't think he thinks enough about the utility of utilities.
Well, now that he's venturing into nuclear, maybe he is growing an appetite for that discussion. But if there's ever a chance to upvote to have you there, I'll give you an upvote.
Yeah, I love how he titled it "Nuclear," perhaps. Here's a question. Yeah, PUCs, I've been involved in activist networks in environmental electricity type of stuff, and a lot of what they do is like this heroic work of intervening on rate cases, which rate cases are when utilities kind of take we want to raise rates, and we have all these reasons to raise rates because we want to invest in new transmission or whatever it is. And what unfortunately I think happens, and for good reason, is a lot of the activists that go into that process, they learn that these PUCs are highly corrupt and captured by the industry, right? And that is absolutely true. I think, though, that it can lead to sort of paralyzing cynicism, that essentially, because these are captured, then we need to just build the electricity system by, like, local communities will just control it themselves and we'll just go away. I think because utilities are publicly regulated, that means they're different than other sectors of the economy that have they're just, free enterprises that they get to do whatever the heck they want, right? Because these utilities are publicly regulated, it means they're inherently political, which means they're subject to contestation and struggle and politics. And so I really don't think we can just see them as just these, horribly corrupt things that we just don't even want to deal with because they're all captured. Because who likes us to do that are the ones that are capturing them, the private interest who are able to rig those rate cases for their own benefit, right? So I would love to sort of talk with people who work with PUCs more to kind of think strategically about how we can more effectively intervene in them, because obviously that's what leads to the cynicism, is that people feel like it's kind of hopeless when you interact with these big hulking institutions.
All right, well, it's about 20 after the hour, so I guess we'll leave it there, but just want to say thank you again to Matt, and thank you to everybody for coming and the great questions and conversations. And yeah, thanks a lot, everybody.
Thank you, Elena. Thanks, everyone.
Take care.